Linearity has become a sort of dirty word in the gaming industry. Many fans deride games that they feel don't provide enough freedom. Games that have a more direct flow often get chided for simply pushing a player down a digital corridor for a dozen hours. Developers continue to push more and more for open world games, assuming that exploration and total freedom is the end-all be-all of gaming experiences. At the end of the day, though, there isn't really a right or wrong answer. There isn't simply one universal concept of good design. Linearity can be hugely important to the success of a game, just the same as being open world can work against one. It just all depends on what the game is trying to do. Certainly there is a place for both types of games in the industry. I'm mostly thinking about this as I play Mirror's Edge Catalyst. A sequel reboot to 2008's Mirror's Edge, the big difference between the two is how the original game was very linear while the sequel is open world. Interestingly, Catalyst has gotten complaints from fans for either being not open enough or too open. The open world nature of a game can often give full life to the environment or setting. Far Cry games do a great job making you feel like you're really in a fictional country. Shadows of Mordor also give player full access to the grim dark world of Middle-earth. Games like The Witcher or Fallout really benefit from the expansive worlds, since the setting is a huge draw. Even some superhero games really do a good job. Spider-Man 2, the video game, marked the first time players got to freely swing around New York City, giving a truer Spider-Man experience. And of course, GTA games have fully realized metropolitan areas that almost make the city a character of its own. These are games that greatly benefit from being open world. Far Cry down a singular path would essentially just be a Call of Duty clone of sorts. Fallout without the vast wasteland to navigate would lose a key part of its atmosphere. Even Spider-Man 2, the video game, would just be your typical superhero arcade game. At the end of the day, these games were built around the premise of sandbox play. They're built from the ground up around the setting being open world and the game playing in a non-linear fashion. That's why it works for those games. In Mirror's Edge Catalyst, it tends to feel open world just for the sake of it. There isn't really much to do or explore. The side missions, while often contextually logical, are repetitive and offers little sightseeing direction. Running from story mission to story mission is fun and provides a relatively safe place to hone your skills, but its additions to the game overall are minimal. I'd argue that a game like Mirror's Edge actually benefits more from being linear. The nice thing about the first game being linear is that it makes every level stand apart from the others. The developers had to treat each mission as its own unique thing, giving them the ability to adequately design distinctly different obstacle courses. Players get through them by learning the course and becoming comfortable with the controls. It's also heavily built on the gameplay mechanic of motion. You're constantly moving forward. You're encouraged to avoid enemies and keep going straight. It's about quick reaction and being able to spot the right path quickly. That's still a part of it in Catalyst, to be sure, but because it's more open, the story missions feel substantially shorter. Additionally, the level designs feel a tad more generic and repetitious. They essentially all blend together with little to distinguish one level from the next. The game is still fun due to the running mechanics and an improved, more satisfying combat system, but it all feels a bit more bland overall. Linearity is especially important in games focused on a strong narrative. Consider the Final Fantasy games. Barring a few exceptions, many of them do a good job pushing players down a particular route without making it feel like you have no choice. Players can explore any region of the map that are within their range. Being able to explore a couple of irrelevant towns doesn't make them open-world sandboxes, but they do disrupt the linear orientation of the narrative. However, more or less, most players will wind up just going to where the story tells them to go with minimal exploration. And this is not a bad thing, though. Given those RPGs are built around their stories, it's important to retain focus on it, or it falls apart. At some point in every Final Fantasy game, though, the world does open up. You get to a point before the final dungeon and boss in which you get free reign to explore the whole world in your airship. The main reason for this is to complete side quests, most of which are not connected to the narrative in the slightest. Though not always, they do often wind up being the acquisition of extra powerful weapons, armor, or summons. It's very rare that a side quest that requires exploration is connected at all to the main narrative. While it's nice to be able to traverse the world map of your own volition, it creates a disconnect with the rest of the game. For the first 30 hours of it, you're pretty focused on progressing the story. Everything in the game is in service of the narrative, and always building up to that one giant threat that will end the world if you don't stop them. So now with that looming, how about spending hours racing and breeding chocobos? Rockstar is pretty good at open world games. Red Dead Redemption really utilizes their open world to further their characters. There is a clear central narrative to the game, but so much of the plot is around former gang member John Marston trying to pay off his debts to society and reform himself. His criminal days are over and he's trying to rebuild his life as a decent, hardworking citizen. The gameplay is more oriented towards players taking up side quests for other citizens. While there certainly are your classic busy work missions typical of open world games, most of these missions have little to do with the central story, but help showcase Marston's attempt at redemption, which is the central theme of the game. If Red Dead Redemption were linear, with minimal player choice as to where to go and what missions to take, you would lose an element of that redemption process. Players connect more with Marston trying to go straight and narrow because they themselves have to decide what to do. Helping random citizens in an open world environment feels more poignant because you don't have to do that, just like Marston doesn't have to do that. It's your choice, and you are John Marston. The Last of Us, conversely, might be the perfect example of how to do linearity. At the end of the day, players can only really go forward to the next point. You can't really backtrack, and there aren't tons of different routes or paths to take. This is perfectly fitting of the story, which centers on escorting Ellie to the Fireflies with laser focus. If players could backtrack, you'd lose the sense of urgency, as well as the sense of adventure. Everything in the game is in service of that story. That drives everything. Too much freedom and you distract from the narrative and character development. And if you distract from those things, then you get a pretty average game that feels unfocused. However, it does a great job never feeling super linear. The maps are often large and open, and collectibles are usually things that provide further insight into the world around you, which encourages players to look around. You'll follow paths that might be dead ends, or check buildings or areas that are clearly not on the way to your ultimate destination. But there is a reason to look to the sides rather than simply walking directly to the next point to advance the story, as you would do in, say, Uncharted. On the negative side, Far Cry games feel a bit like open world games just for the sake of it. There is a strong central story, but you're often encouraged to waste your time doing tedious unrelated tasks like liberating outposts or radio towers. The reason to do those, of course, are to unlock other side quests that have even less to do with anything. These range from racing to deliver weapons, to hunting a random animal with a random weapon. Such missions have nothing to do with anything. They don't further the story or add to the character, and they don't really even fully further realize the world. It's just busy work, because a game needs something for you to do. That, of course, is ultimately a growing problem with many open world games. The worlds are so expansive and pretty, but there's not a ton of interesting things to do. The Legend of Zelda series is a great example of how to do open world. Those games want to provide a sense of adventure more than they want to push a particularly strong central narrative, though those do exist. By giving players total choice over where to go next, it really helps create that atmosphere. It makes it easier to get absorbed into the world and the adventure. The narrative is in service of the world, not the other way around. Of course, you could also do what Dark Souls does. Not a purely open world game, and indeed most of it is pretty much going down one narrow pathway, Dark Souls doesn't cut players off from any part of the world. Some players might not enjoy the lack of direction, and it isn't hard to wander off into an area where you're clearly not supposed to be at yet, and then you get completely wrecked by enemies that are far too tough for your skill level. However, this design choice makes exploration an integral part of the game, so while it doesn't fit your traditional open world game, it ultimately does provide the same experience. There is, obviously, a point in which a game can become too linear. Final Fantasy XIII was pretty notorious for having pushed players down a hyperlinear corridor moving from cutscene to cutscene. And that's fine for a little while, but this game did it for nearly 50 hours worth of game. That's just too much, and you really start to feel it. Being that linear even harms the narrative, as it starts to make everything drag and the pacing feels off. A similar thing could be said about, say, Uncharted Drake's Fortune. The maps are rather small and the corridors are pretty narrow, and you just move from cutscene to cutscene, repeating the same shootouts in between. As a final note, I've heard it mentioned that things like the Super Nintendo Mario games are a perfect balance between linear and open world. Each world in Super Mario Bros. Ultimately provides minimal choice of where to go, but those occasions in which you do get a choice stand out. Even more, there are various shortcuts and secret pathways that can help you skip entire sections of the game. Now, I fully agree that alternate pathways and secret shortcuts are a great way to make your rather linear game not feel linear at all, but I'm not so sure I agree with the idea that being able to skip sections of the game is good design. There are levels in Donkey Kong Country in which you can skip the entire level, but is it really good game design to create something that players can use to avoid playing the game? Freedom and choice is great and all, but the game is still something that's supposed to be played. Skipping bits here and there is fine, but skipping the majority of the game should not be considered a positive design element. Sure, it's kind of funny that at the beginning of Far Cry 4, if you just wait 15 minutes, you get an ending and the credits roll. But is that really good design that you can finish the game without actually playing it at all? It's still a game. So, overall, linearity is not inherently bad, just as open sandboxes are inherently good. It just all depends on what your focus is. A game like The Last of Us would have suffered from being open world. It would have felt unfocused and the narrative would have paid the price, which that itself would have also made everything else in the game feel distracted and weak. Similarly, Ocarina of Time or Mario 64 being linear would have hurt those games as well, with the epic scale of adventure feeling condensed and less grand and exciting. Just know what you're going for and ask yourself this. What is the central experience you want the players to have? Is it a strong story? Is it a sense of epic adventure? Is it just the act of playing the game for fun? And then build your game around that. Linearity is not bad, just use it wisely.